Hello, and welcome to the Workflow Show, offering workflow therapy whilst listening to discussions on development, deployment, and maintenance of secure media asset management solutions. I'm Jason Whetstone, Senior Workflow Engineer and Developer at Chesapeake Systems.
And I'm Ben Kilberg, Senior Solutions Architect at Chesa.
Today on the Workflow Show, we'll talk with Ben Meadors, Post-Production Engineer for Spotify Studios. We'll highlight some of the things that Spotify does in addition to music streaming. We'll cover some of the processes that Ben helped establish for production of video projects at Spotify Studios, and we'll talk about how those processes were created, the importance of gathering feedback and earning buy-in from team members, and the value of creating and distributing clear documentation of the process. Then we'll get into the workflows of podcast production versus video production. How are they similar and different? But first, here are a few reminders. If you have suggestions or feedback on the Workflow Show, or would like for us to cover something we haven't, please let us know. Email workflowshow@chesa.com or at ChesaPro or at WorkflowShow on Twitter. Please guys, hit the subscribe button. It'll help you know when new episodes are available and get some more of that workflow therapy you're here for. And now let's get on to our discussion with Ben Meadors. So Ben, why don't you tell us a little bit about Spotify Studios, and then we'll talk a little bit about you and how you got there. What I'm interested in is, I think our listeners and a lot of us know Spotify as a streaming platform, right? So been around for a while. Tell us what you're getting into, or what Spotify is getting into these days.
I think we've seen a huge push for podcast creation in the last year or so. You see Spotify acquiring Gimlet and Parcast and The Ringer, and then kind of dramatically building out the infrastructure to create content. And so I think Spotify is moving more towards creating content.
Creating that original content.
Correct.
Right?
Creating original content. In some cases, it's licensing content or creating exclusive content. The Michelle Obama podcast. All that stuff.
Gotcha. So as a production engineer, what would you say? Like, describe your role a little bit. Talk about what you do.
I oversee post-production technology, infrastructure, and services for Spotify Studios in Los Angeles.
Gotcha. So what does a day-to-day look like for you?
It's kind of like two buckets, right? There's the sort of the day-to-day operational work, making sure the team that I oversee has everything they need. The other half is working on design and build and workflow design, both for video content creation teams and some of the podcast content creation teams, as it relates to both the infrastructure on site in Los Angeles and our cloud infrastructure.
Okay, so you're kind of designing the processes of bringing content in and through the organization, all the way up and through delivery and archive, right?
Exactly. So I'm responsible for making sure our assets are safe from acquisition all the way to, you're right, archive. Exactly.
Okay, great. That's a great point to make, I think. And I from my own experience working with you guys, and my experience just talking to you, Ben, is that your organization seems to be very well organized. Everybody seems to have their roles and they know what they're doing. The sort of journey that a project takes seems to be very well defined. So I think it's really worth putting a fine point on the fact that the big reason for that is because you have a resource yourself in place to help the team sort of figure out what all those steps are and then document them, right?
Yeah. That's a big thing for sure. I feel really lucky that the team I came into had already done a really great job of documenting every single thing you could possibly think of and making it easy to find, which is really great. And I don't think you see that in a lot of places these days, particularly in content creation, because it changes all the time. But having all those things in one centralized place has really helped us quickly onboard and offboard people and make sure everybody understands, well, this is where our naming conventions are. This is where we put files. This is where files go. Yeah, that's been really helpful. A lot of our projects, at least on the video side, are quick turnaround, and editors come in for 2 weeks and leave, and we'll get another editor. So it's like a revolving door of people, right? So as long as we have everything documented clearly and simply, there's a lot less hiccups.
I remember sitting in a room with you and two of your media managers. You guys kind of had an aha about, I was trying to sort of talk about your process and how you guys do things, and you all kind of looked at each other and said, "Oh, why don't you just show him it's the internal site that everybody goes."
Yeah, our internal.
Everybody goes. Yeah, and I saw that and I was just like, "This is fantastic." I mean, this is most of the questions that a person walking into an organization like this, the answers to those questions. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. We actually just overhauled it. We did host an internal Google site, and it's just like an internal web page that had for every role. So there's a page for editors, a page for AEs, a page for the media team, a page for the audio engineers, a page for the colorists. And it just has like it's a quick crib sheet of everything you would need to know in terms of like, okay, for the media team, how do I offload? What do I use to offload? Where do I offload to? For the AEs, it's here are naming conventions. Here's where we keep all of our master assets. Here's our proxy file settings. For the editors, it's broadcast guidelines for where the bug goes or stuff like that. And just having all that in place just makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, very detailed. There's screenshots there. There's, like you said, just all the details about project settings, where the bugs go, all that. It's just a great resource.
I think that was born out of it started before I arrived. It was born out of the video team at the time was pushing out a lot of content per week. They were making videos primarily for the playlist to shows. Those videos usually had like a week or less turnaround time from the shoot date. So we had to have everything very, very, very tight so that there were no delays in delivery. And we just kind of kept that practice ever since. And it's been really, like you say, very, very helpful.
Let me back up for a minute and let's talk about the actual videos that your team produces. Where would listeners be seeing those videos? Like, let's connect the dots.
Currently, if you're watching, there's two like realms now, right? There's social. We're creating videos for Instagram or TikTok or whatever. The bulk of the studio's existence, we were making videos for the playlist to show. There's 3 of them. There used to be a 4th a long time ago called Rock This that some people might remember. But essentially, they're all little artist features. There's either live performances or sometimes we call them cover stories, which is a piece about the artist and maybe the album they're working on or their inspirations or things they like to do. It's just a way to help people connect more with the music. And that's what those videos are. So they're kind of embedded in a playlist. So if you're listening to Hot Country, for example, you'll hear a few songs and you might see a video of, I don't know, like Midland or I'm forgetting all my Hot Country artists.
But yeah, just to give the listeners a little bit of context on where they might see some of these videos. Let's talk a little bit about you really quick. How did you get to the point of becoming production engineer at Spotify Studios? Just tell us a little bit about your education, maybe some of your previous experiences.
Yeah, I started in the post world at a company called Arc Media in New York. They make documentaries for PBS, things like Finding Your Roots, a lot of American Experience shows. I really loved that job. It was a great time. I learned a lot about post-production, kind of like old school documentary filmmaking post-production, which is really great. From there, I moved to a company called Able Cine. They're a full-service digital cinema camera company where I was the integrated services manager and helped run the integration department. We built out studios and post-production facilities and almost anything we could build,
Gotcha.
And then from there, I moved to Spotify. I was a senior AV engineer for a while until this role popped up in LA.
Awesome. So what are some of the challenges that you were kind of presented with right away when you started there?
The first one was they were completely on an external hard drive workflow.
We've never heard this story before, have we, Kilberg?
Ever heard this story?
Never once. Nope.
I think I can remember how much. Something like I want to say around 600 terabytes of raw assets.
Oh wow!
Because we shoot at 3.2K on RELXs for that latitude and all that stuff. So everything is beefy.
Mm-hmm.
And we have it backed up in 2 places. So suddenly I have when I walked in the first day. Jason, you never saw this room, I don't think, but there was just a room with like 4 cabinets of hard drives.
Mm-hmm.
So the biggest challenge was, and they have a whole workflow centered around duplicating things to hard drives and making sure things are backed up and moving things to AE drives and editor drives. So the first thing was like pulling all that apart and understanding how they were working. And then I think I called Peter Price and said, I need some help. It's not a one-person job to sort of transition. So the big challenge first was just me wrapping my brain around their workflows and understanding what they were making, how they were making it,
right?
Soup to nuts, and then saying, "Oh, what can we do? One, to get them on the shared storage. So they need, we're wasting too much time and money on external hard drives. Then two, can we put in a MAM that would help? Because we have terabytes of B-roll, right? We shoot all over the country. But we have no quick way to find it. A creative producer would say we had to shoot in Nashville. We got this thing of this forest. See if you can find it.
Yeah.
Somebody who's on the shoot might say, oh yeah, that was in February of 2017. We'll go back to this drive.
I'm sure all of our listeners are like, oh yeah, this is the story.
The age-old story. So those were the 2 big challenges were at first understanding what was going on and then figuring out what the plan would be to kind of push them into, I don't know, the new world. What do you want to call it? You can't scale out and produce quickly if you're copying things to drives.
Right.
It's not going to work.
No.
Right.
No. So editor A needs footage B that's on drive C, and that editor B is using drive C, and yeah, we get it. So, I mean, how big of a work group would you say, is working on this content? Like, how many people did you need to figure this out for?
The video creative team and post-production team is probably around, when we're at full tilt, probably 30 to 40 people max.
Okay.
Right now it's a little lean as we're, in the pandemic times, it's harder to create content, as I'm sure we all are feeling.
Yeah. Well,
Indeed.
so what, speaking of that, like, that's a great transition into, like, what are you guys doing about that? What's your, yeah.
I think like everybody else in March, we were scrambling to figure out what to do, right? Particularly around video. I think for primarily the podcast folks could keep working, without too much trouble. It's
Right.
more on that side. It was more like figuring out what mics to use, what room treatments to use, if there's an interface we should get, if there's an online service we should use. On the video side, it was, we have this server at the office that nobody can connect to. What do we do?
Right.
So I think for the first month while we were figuring it out, because it kind of got, like most people, this sort of happened all in a day. Like suddenly it was everybody worked from home right away.
Right.
So for the first month, we went back to an external drive workflow while we figured out what to do.
Okay, that's the devil, right? you know what the challenges are there, and you've done it before, so that's.
Yeah, and we still had Iconic in place at that point.
Okay.
So we could still have our review and approval process. And you're right, like they all knew how to be users working on external drives, so it was less stress for everybody. Where it eventually hit a point of like not working anymore was we were couriering drives around every day, and that the courier couldn't get in touch with somebody. There's just so many more delays introduced in those workflows. So while they were doing that, I was kind of digging around with different remote workflows. We looked at Bebop, which was really cool. We looked at spinning up machines ourselves in the cloud. Eventually, what we landed on was using Jump Desktop.
Okay.
It just works great. I don't have any complaints. It has two-factor authentication. Sound travels over it pretty well. It's not, it's not frame accurate, but we haven't had really any complaints from our editors on like they can't do fine cuts for the most part. Sometimes it gets really hard. Sometimes some of the sizzles they cut are very, very in line with the music they're using in the bed. So sometimes that gets tricky. But for the most part, it's been really great. And so we were able to just make use of all of our computers in the office. For all of our users, it's no different than sitting at the office.
Gotcha.
So that's a VNC client that does tunneling with two-factor authentication over the internet. So like you said, there isn't any great visual resolution. You're going to deal with pixelated weirdness, but at least people can get access to their machine. They can get access to the shared storage. And people can get their jobs done, albeit not in the best of quality remotely.
Right. So, for the editors, they're not doing the color grade. So it's not super important for them to have color accuracy.
Right.
For the colorist, we worked out a remote grade. So he has a Resolve system at home with a Flanders monitor at home. We have an identical system without a monitor at the office. They're both on a VPN, dupes the media at the office and at his house. So, he can just send off the remote render when he's ready.
Got it.
Just save some time. We still have to get him the media at the top of the shoot. But that's way better than sending around like 4 or 5 drives a day.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
It also made me so nervous to just send drives around. You never know what's going to happen. They get lost. They fall off the truck. They deliver to the wrong address.
I mean, and that's a liability for your assets as well.
Yeah, and we only did it for maybe a few 3 or 4 weeks, and no hiccups or anything. But it was still quite. I'm paranoid about that stuff. I think it would be. So anyway, it's been working out pretty well. I think we've been doing that since April.
Yeah, that's great.
More or less.
That's great. I'm glad that's working out for you. Yeah,
cool.
That's great. That's great.
And VNC for our listeners is virtual network computing. Just to
typically that's kind of
like to do that.
That's when we think of VNC, we think of screen sharing essentially, or not really screen sharing, but you're actually you're actually controlling remotely another desktop machine. So how often do you guys get together and really just kind of refine the process or revise the process?
That's actually a really important thing to do. I think that's the only reason like Iconic implementation went well, right? Is that we got in front of the stakeholders and asked them what problems they have. In terms of like checking in, so I have every month I have a check-in with our post-production coordinators and our media managers and our AEs. And I just say, please tell me what's working, what's not working. That has been really useful. We also do a quarterly software review.
Okay.
I like that you mentioned AEs. I feel like AEs are your secret weapon because one, they're usually very tech savvy. they're also the ones that assist the editors directly. So if an editor is going off course or off the guide rails, the AEs hopefully know enough and have your back to support them and get them back on the right track. So I try to build a very close relationship with all of our AEs, both me and the media team, just as we're all in alignment all the time. Mm-hmm. That really helps, I find.
And then so talk about your media team, because this is another, I think obviously every post-production organization has editors and producers. Most of them hopefully have AEs, but your media team, what is a day like for them?
Ooh, a day like for them, it consists of a lot of different things now. So everything from, before pre-pandemic times, they were ingesting media from the field. Okay. Right? That was a big part of their day. Okay. It still is to a certain extent. Some of it's been automated now. But a lot of their time now is spent onboarding production partners or onboarding new editors or AEs into the processes that we have. If there's a request to gather assets for a sizzle reel or something like that, it's media's job to go find those assets and deliver them.
Gotcha. And they don't necessarily... They are your process evangelists, I guess, right?
Yeah, you're right. That's exactly what it is.
So they're the ones kind of in charge of making sure that the process is actually happening and that, people have what they need to keep the projects rolling, keep the process rolling, and then feedback if there's anything missing or, basically provide those people with what they need, whether it's training or documentation or whatever it is.
Exactly. And, sometimes it's just hopping on a quick call a quick call and showing like, hey, this is how you do this process in Iconic or sort of like the catch-all for any issues.
Right. So I think that's a really good thing to call out is that, these guys are great at doing their job. And there are resources there to make sure that things. It sounds like in your organization, they're a little bit of a mix between what we would traditionally call like a media manager, an asset manager, and a post-production supervisor.
Yeah, I would say they kind of mix between your traditional asset management and more of like a tier one help.
Okay, gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
They have to be tech savvy enough to support workflow, but also be attentive to detail around asset organization.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and they're great at that. I love my team. So I am not as detail oriented as they are.
And that is definitely, I will say from my own experience, having that role, that you really do have to have attention to detail. You have to be willing to ask questions and push back sometimes, and really get those details. So what are some of the challenges that you've had with, you have your group that you work with, the video team, the Spotify Studios, and what are some of the challenges you've had working with other aspects of the organization? So, there's also podcasting. That's a completely different team of people, different workflow, different applications, different support, different building, different side of the country, different country in some respects.
Yeah. Well, yeah. In fact, in our global markets, we have podcasts all over the world now, which is fantastic. Right.
So let's talk about that a little bit. What's it like to work?
Maybe I should break down like the structure real quick.
Okay.
So Spotify Studios is what I would call the umbrella organization around the 5 studios that currently sit underneath it. There's the ones I mentioned earlier that Spotify acquired, Gimlet, Parcast, and The Ringer. There's also the video team, which we've been talking about. And there's also an unnamed Studio 4, which is also making podcasts. A lot of those, particularly those 3 podcasts, companies, Gimlet, Parcast, and The Ringer, they already have very well-established ways of working. They're all quite successful, and they're all really good at what they do. So, we didn't want to come in, and we still haven't come in and said, like, we're going to change the way you work. Mm-hmm. They all know their workflow the best, right? So we're trying to just respect that and standardize and unify across all 5 studios where we can. At the same time, the nice thing is, like, none of these studios have an established asset management system. Mm-hmm. They all have their own ways of tracking stuff, but they wouldn't have what we would all call a MAM.
Right. Gotcha.
That's kind of the nice thing about Iconic and Iconic's hybrid workflow and the capabilities of the storage gateway is that we can slot in the ISG and Iconic where it makes sense for each of these studios. So for the video team, Iconic is very embedded in the day-to-day workflow. Like they're using review and improve and commenting and transcoding and transcription, all that stuff. But for other teams, we might just use Iconic as an index of their final master assets. So the bare minimum for each of these studios is that we need to be able to see your final master assets so we can back them up to the cloud and hopefully tag them as well. That would be ideal.
Okay. So you have very, very detailed, well-documented process for the people that you work directly with and for that part of your job and your organization, your work group. But you just have some pretty high-level requirements, goals in terms of using the tools and the process for the overall organization. Get your masters in there. This is the way they get submitted, and
Right. So it's a lot of, and we're in the middle of this process now, so I don't have too much to say about it other than that we're trying to pull apart each team's workflow and understand it, and then that'll help us guide on what to do next. And part of that is talking to the stakeholders, understanding if there's gaps in what they need, or if they don't want anything new. And, it's a line to walk.
Sure. If what they have is working for them, and there's
and why would we want to change that, right? Like if it's working, as long as it's scalable, it's good to go.
Yeah.
We just want to make sure everything's safely backed up
and secure.
Yes.
Especially in this day and age of everybody has to be able to get to their stuff. Everybody who should be able to get to their stuff should be able to get to their stuff, and no one else. So why don't we talk a little bit about podcast and the workflow of creating podcasts and producing podcasts? I want to talk about this because I think it's something that, when we talk about podcasts, obviously, we're really talking about producing an audio master, essentially. On the show here, we talk a lot about producing video. I mean, we ideally would talk about producing all sorts of media, but we focus a lot on the video workflow. There's so many different categories of video in terms of all the different parts of the industry that we talk about: news, sports, episodic TV, film, all this different stuff. But let's talk about the audio workflow a little bit and the podcasting workflow. One of the things that strikes me is just difference in the content in terms of file sizes. So a workflow that may work really well. Well, let's put it this way. Let's talk about it from a video perspective. So, some of the considerations that we talk about for, say, remote video editing, they're not really as big of a deal when you talk about an audio project, right?
Totally agree. Yeah, in some cases they're not affected at all. Anybody could. All you need to cut a podcast is a laptop and a good pair of headphones, right?
Right.
As long as you have a good capture. Everything else is just nice to have.
Sure.
On the video side, you just need a lot more stuff. It's just that's sort of a lot short of it, right? I think also maybe one thing to call out, because a lot of people there's differences between video and audio production, right? That everybody sort of understands. But what's important to call out about it is that as you try to scale out, because video production is so much more resource intensive, you got to kind of pay more attention to it when you're getting ready to scale out, right? It's things like, storage space, transfer time, bandwidth needed, how long it's going to take to upload a file, export time, project file size, all that stuff is exponentially larger with the video production just by nature of adding video to it.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the application. When we talk about video production, we're talking Avid, Premiere, Resolve. There's all these different video editing applications that we talk about a lot on this show. We don't talk as much about the audio stuff like Pro Tools, for example. So I've been a Pro Tools user for almost 20 years now. And actually, I think it's more than that. It is more than that. Darn it. Wow. Pro Tools doesn't render. That's something that, when you have this giant video project in Premiere, for example, your application is not opening all those video files at once and playing them all back at once, right? It's rendering those. You're playing back a render, essentially, when you play back the timeline. Pro Tools doesn't do that. So it works a little bit differently than some of these video applications, just by virtue of the fact that it really does need to have access to all those audio files on the timeline. And when you're working on, say, a film score or even a post audio production, it's a little bit different. You may end up having to, depending on how big your session is, you may end up having to mix stems, which is kind of the equivalent of doing a render in Premiere. But that's something that that's something that sort of sets these applications apart quite a bit. Is just the fact that there's no rendering involved in these audio workstation applications.
There's DSP involved, right? And there's real-time processes. And then when we're bouncing files to disk, certainly that's a render. But you're right, there's no massive frame buffer. We're not worried about, having a gigabyte worth of aggregate bandwidth or even multiple hundreds of megabytes per second for each individual workstation because some videographer decided or DP decided that they wanted to use the biggest codec that they had available to them because they wanted to.
So that means that Pro Tools, as opposed to Premiere, may need to have many files open at once, which means that performance over a network connection could suffer. Even though, you've looked and you've seen by the numbers, we're just playing back audio, so this should work just fine. But that's one thing I think to call out in terms of the differences between a video and an audio workflow.
I mean, it's the immediacy of the
Sure.
need to play back those files, right? Depending upon how low the buffer settings are in your digital audio workstations, right? Is it set to 256? Is it set to 512? Is it set to 1024, right? Because the greater the buffer setting, the more streams and the longer essentially the computer has to make sure the audio plays out correctly. And if that's coming from shared storage over a network and the network is saturated, it can cause problems, as opposed to coming directly from an internal SSD or NVMe drive, which is wickedly fast and can just, like Spitfire, deliver unto you 100 audio files without issue.
Right. So that a lot of that plays into it. But then on the flip side of it, just by virtue of the fact that the files are small and the project itself, the overall project itself is probably small, you can take advantage of workflows that you wouldn't necessarily be able to take advantage of with video. Things that I don't want to say we wouldn't even think of doing. We think of doing them all the time. It's just we run into limitations. Like use the Dropbox workflow. Use the Dropbox workflow, which is like, oh, I'm going to throw this project in Dropbox and it's just going to show up on your machine. Sure, that's great if you're talking about, a few hundred audio files, but if you're talking about a few hundred video files, it's a little different.
Yeah, exactly. And that Dropbox workflow is something that we're totally using right now for the remote production, and it's been great.
Yeah, and it almost works like shared storage when you look at it. It's
been thinking recently, like, why did we have to stop doing this when the pandemic is over?
Right.
Like, why not make every user's workstation their editing workstation as well? Like, why do we have to be direct connected to storage ever?
Right.
That opens up a lot more possibilities, at least from the audio side.
That's certainly the case with things like proxy edit workflows. Like, do you guys use those workflows as well in your
yeah, but we do use edit proxies in the workflow just because we shoot such a high resolution. The open drive systems we have could likely stand it, but just for ease of scalability, it's better to just use those. I think we use ProRes proxy codec. I think that's what we use.
Okay. For your gotcha. Yeah.
Essentially an offline online workflow. But Premiere has made it so easy these days. Still have like horrors from having to relink an Avid. I'm sure you guys are familiar with how finicky Avid can be.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
I mean, all the NLEs are a little bit tipsy around the edges. It just depends on, what their sensitive spot is and whether or not you're like, oh, shit, don't talk about its parents. It'll just flip out, whatever it is, right?
I've actually found that Resolve has gotten pretty good
these
days. I had a crazy idea a month ago or 2 months ago, like maybe we should just all cut in Resolve.
A lot of people have been having that idea.
I think it's a great idea. And I think the Fairlight system is good enough for some audio work, you guys, but it was good enough for basic.
It certainly has a good pedigree.
Yeah,
for sure.
So one of the things I want to come back around to, let's talk a little bit about that Dropbox workflow, just because it's good to define things for people if we're just whizzing past it, right? I think what we're talking about is essentially caching files locally to an internal hard drive based upon a cloud network share, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Kilberg, for breaking this down. I did want to.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that allows us to, have our cake and eat it too in some ways, because there's a central location where everybody can get to what they need and to push back what they need. And then they also have the benefit of working locally and having it right in front of them. And internally, even though it might chew up internal space on their drive, essentially the files in their drive become expendable after, you've finished your final master and you can just upload things again. Is that what you guys are doing on a regular basis, Ben?
Yeah, I think some of our studios are using Dropbox. Others have their own file sharing systems, like, your boxes, your P clouds, whatever. But essentially, that's what you're describing is correct, right? Like there's a NAS share on site that things get recorded to, and those things get shared out via Dropbox or whichever collaboration tool that team is using. And you're right, it makes it so much easier, right? You don't have to sneak around anything. If you're flying on a plane somewhere, your files are with you. You don't have to be online to keep working. Those are all really beneficial.
For sure. Let's talk a little nitty gritty about some of the podcast stuff in terms of how you guys and what the standards are for what people need to deliver to you. And if you're sharing stuff back around, is that, broadcast WAV files or the final renders, MP3s? Like, I'm just curious, obviously being an audio guy myself and, doing the workflow show on a regular basis, it's just fascinating to be able to chat with you.
Yeah. I can speak to, assets we receive, like from finished productions, if that's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
You
sure.
always ask for the session stems and the session files, as well as the final output as an MP3 and as a WAV.
Okay.
Pretty standard stuff.
Right.
We have some delivery specs, but the nice thing is that each of these studios has already been delivering to the platform for a long time. So they handle all that stuff. We just make sure it's all backed up and safe.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Which is great. It would be I think a large bottleneck if we were receiving and uploading all of those shows.
For sure. So let's dig into the stems a little bit, because I know stems means one thing to some people and another thing to others, right?
That's a good question.
I mean, typically when we talk about stems in the music world, it might be, I want all of my drums, at least maybe the overheads and the toms, submixed into a stereo file, and then a separate file for the snare and the kick, separate file for the bass and vocals, and then maybe everything else for guitars and keys all in different files, so that a mix engineer or somebody else, even in the video world, they might want to say like, oh, I want to drop the lyrics out of this because I just want it to be this awesome fight scene or into the background dialogue.
Yep.
How does that translate into the podcast world?
Yeah, I think it's show dependent.
Okay.
At minimum, typically we get the stems as the music bed and the dialogue.
Okay.
Sometimes we'll get every individual talent as a stem. It totally depends on the show and if we have any plans to cut social with it afterwards, as far as I know.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So it's that ultimate use of reuse, I should say, with that in mind. What's going to give us the most flexibility in the future?
Exactly. So it's always looking backwards and saying like, well, what if we need to cut a sizzle 6 months from now?
And I imagine part of that's licensing too with the music, right? Meaning like, oh, I want to make sure we have clearance for this before that's, we play that anywhere else that we might not be allowed to.
Yeah, exactly. That's a big part of it. Usually there's always a licensing review as part of any asset that goes out.
Frickin' lawyers, man.
Let's talk a little bit about, I know this is an interesting, I want to talk about a feature request that we talked about, Ben, you and I.
Oh yeah?
It was the watermarking of the videos and being able to have that sort of appearing on demand. And I'd like to get from you the reason why that was so important.
Well,
it's part of as part of your review and approve workflow.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Right. So part of the review and approval workflow, one stage is getting the artist team to review the video, and they get to give us their feedback. Sometimes we send out a video, and then it ends up a rough cut of a video, I should say, and it ends up on social media.
So it's a not finished, not approved, not fully approved.
So we have unfinished work going out the door to be reviewed, and sometimes it's getting put out on social media. So we just decided the best way to do it is just put a huge watermark across it.
Is that because people are being savvy and like going into whatever tool you're using and pulling out the source code and pulling out the URL? Like, what are people doing?
Some people were just screen capping it. This happens all the time with social media. People are screen capping TikTok video, whatever. And I think that's what happened. This before I was at this role, but it's happened enough times that we decided to just watermark everything.
Okay.
As you probably know, Jason, like it's a bummer to have to watermark those files, and you have duplicate files just sitting around in storage. So the request to Iconic was, can we make it been on demand on the share link?
Yeah, and that's not an easy request to fulfill. It's it kind of involves digging into the actual code for the player and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of times some of the digital asset management platforms they might use code from another player. They might have licensed a player that they use in their software, and that's perfectly legit. But it means that they can't get in there and actually dig into the code of that because it's something that they've licensed. So that's always a challenge. And that's just something that I got to say, it's a testament to the fact that people want something. If people want something and they want to share something, they're probably going to find ways to get around whatever measures you've tried to put in place.
Yeah. It's an uphill battle all the time. We're trying to get it as safe as we can on our end. And that includes things like limiting those shares, making sure nobody external can view those shares, all that kind of stuff. All that your typical, like, just shut it down. If we can air gap it, that's even better.
Right.
All that kind of stuff.
So this is a shout out to our listeners. Please check and make sure you are able to share something before you share it. And if people are screen capping, I have to believe that they know they shouldn't be sharing things. Yeah. So that's a good hint. If you have to use a screen capture tool, you probably should not be sharing it.
Oh, one thing I wanted to circle back around to, and we were talking about how documentation has really helped define and speed up internal processes and onboarding. A question that came to mind was, how soon do people receive the documentation? Like if I'm a freelancer coming to do some work for you guys, how quick do I get access to how it is and how you guys do work?
The general answer is as soon as we possibly can, right? So if we're starting a week from now and we have their personal email address and they're willing to read stuff ahead of time, we'll send them a link to the site. We have a way to share it out securely without it being behind single sign-on. So the sooner the better. And then we, on their onboarding day, we say like, do you want to go through this in depth? Do you have questions? So just make sure they understand it. And we also make sure that they have access to that written documentation. What we've started doing recently is having little 2 or 3 minute video guides.
Oh, awesome.
Here's how you share a link. Here's how you tag metadata. Here's how you transcode something. Here's how you request a transcription. Just having a little video with a little red circle that goes off on the mouse whenever you do something, I found it to be really helpful.
I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
That way we can tell that we're getting less questions about it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and that speeds up workflow immensely. And it speaks to the power of documentation in that if people don't have to wait for an answer on how you wish for them to do things, if they can find the answers themselves, just like we talk about with media asset management, speeding up search process, in terms of work production, if people can just jump into what they need to do, and if that's already been well defined, and even better that you guys have a media team that can support people to do that, it seems like you guys are just really helping to get things done in a timely manner, even though there's extra work that goes into making sure that all of that is in place.
Yeah, it's worth it in the long run. Ultimately, it means less work.
Yeah.
I think also just to maybe add some color to that, I think the other important point is that everybody's bought into the system, right? So they're not going to read the documentation if they don't think it's going to help them, or the system's not going to help them. So we've spent a lot of time getting user buy-in.
Right.
So that's everything from before we moved to Iconic, it was talking about Iconic, asking people what their pain points were, and then coming back and saying, here's how this is going to solve your problems. Does that work for you or not? And starting that out 6 months before we started implementation really helped get everybody on board.
Right. So you guys were excited. You really wanted to jump in and get into it, but you took the time to sort of roll out bits and pieces and communicate and get feedback about how that was going to work.
Actually, in some cases, the silver lining of the pandemic was we got to slow down a little bit and really step through all those things. And it was a great chance to sort of talk to every stakeholder individually, talk through their concerns, and then say, hey, well, let's look at this. Tell me what you think about this. And getting them excited and saying, this is how you're going to save time. This is remember how the old system, remember how convoluted it was to find old assets? Now it's like a 3-button click thing. Let me show you how it works.
Right.
And that gets people excited. And they can run off and go, oh, I have all these other ways I can use these assets now.
Right.
Yep.
And that sort of grows and spreads, and other people hear about it. It makes it much easier to get people to adopt.
For sure. You got to You got to give them the reason to believe.
Right. You've demonstrated the value. That seems like a huge part, right? Selling the story and making it meaningful for them.
You also have to understand their specific pain points. If you're trying to solve the problems you think they need to be solved, but it solves none of their problems, you're not going to get anywhere. I've seen it's happened to me in the past. I've seen it happen in the past. It's just way easier to double check.
Right.
Before you move forward, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's basic salesmanship, right? I mean, well, it should be basic salesmanship to not talk at people, but talk to them and to, help them solve their problem rather than try and give them more work to do.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. It sounds like we're talking about the Phoenix Project. If anybody hasn't read the Phoenix Project, it's a book about how to get lots and lots and lots of work done with a process. I'm reading it now. I highly recommend it. So let's ask you a few fun questions.
Yeah.
What are a few of the coolest workflows you've seen that have really been instrumental in helping people get their work done, either at Spotify or somewhere else?
That's a great question.
And it could be in relation to the pandemic, or it could be just something that you saw that was cool and you just thought it was awesome.
Right.
I mean, one thing recently is just the ability to do the new Resolve 1516 has that new project manager that allows for much easier remote rendering. I think that was a big, powerful thing. I don't know, guys. All I've been looking at is podcast tools recently.
What's cool in podcast tools?
But yeah, there's so many cool things. I think there's a product. This is a good answer. There's a product called Descript, which is really cool. I think the pandemic triggered a lot of innovation in remote workflow.
Absolutely.
And a lot of companies were kind of caught unawares, and other ones that are more cloud-based and AI-based were kind of rubbing their hands together going, finally.
Right.
Everybody's taking us seriously.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yep. Now there's a need for us, and I think that's really true. And Descript is a really cool tool. I think to any Pro Tools user, they'd be pretty adverse to it because it's not Pro Tools. But at the same time, it has everything you need to cut a podcast, right? It has built-in transcription. It even has this new cool feature where if it has, I think, about 10 minutes of audio of a guest, it can then use AI to generate that guest saying a word that you didn't get recorded. Sort of like machine learning deep fake sort of stuff.
Oh, that's great.
I'm probably explaining it poorly, but let's say you're cutting a sentence together and you need one word that you don't have.
Right.
It will generate it for you based on a profile of that voice.
Gotcha. A sound print.
Yeah, it's something like that. I'm not an audio engineer, so I'm probably explaining it poorly, but it is. That sort of stuff is really powerful. I think we're going to see more and more of that.
It's interesting. So you said about how Pro Tools users probably would hate it. And I laughed. I laughed because I know exactly what you mean. But also, I was the one. I've done a lot of dialogue editing in my professional time as an audio engineer. And one of the things that I found myself telling people is I would get an email from a project manager or a producer, and they would say, "Hey, so the client made a change to the script and they need to cut this part out. So if you could just kind of and they would give me a couple of cut points, and I would have to tell them editing recorded speech is not like editing a Word document. It's, there's inflection and there's, all kinds of different things that make it, I can cut it there, but you're not going to like it, and I think, I wonder, I don't know if you know or not, but I wonder if this tools like Descript actually play with that. If they have I gotta believe if they have the ability to construct a word from recorded speech that they would be able to say, oh, change the inflection so that I can actually edit here.
Isotope RX Advanced already does that.
Okay. Thank you, Ben.
There's a lot of really cool dynamic EQ things out there.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the new big trends in audio. I'm not an audio engineer again, but in the plugins I've seen my guys using, that's those are the sort of the new things they're excited about.
Mm-hmm.
I think that makes their jobs a lot easier, is my understanding.
That's great. So Kilberg and I are big fans of Isotope, and their suite of plugins. They're very cool. But RX is their it's their noise reduction suite. There's so many different tools as part of RX that it just does a lot of really cool stuff. And there's also an advanced version that does surround and all kinds of other surround.
It's very powerful.
Yes.
I think primarily our teams use the post-production suite.
Okay.
Which I think is RX7 and Ozone. I'm probably getting this wrong.
No, you're right. You're right.
But it's very heavy.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think it's at some point we wanted to try and standardize the plugins everybody was using, and I think the plan was to just use Isotope. I think we ditched that plan because we didn't want to impede too much on creative technique. But
one of the things that I love about Alloy, their plugin Alloy, it's a channel strip plugin, and I mean it's a great plugin. I'm sure I'm going to be proven wrong here, but it's I wouldn't say that it is that much more wonderful or fantastic than any other channel strip plugin. But the fact that you can run a track of audio through one single plugin and get all of your processing done just really streamlines workflow, I found. And that plugin actually allows you to change the order of the signal chain and all that kind of stuff, so you can actually treat it like you would a patch bay or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, most of the good DAWs out there allow you to save channel strips as presets as well. So if you've got your favorite EQ or compressor or reverb or whatever it is, you can save that as essentially a chain of effects that'll just pop in for any of the channels, which is pretty cool too. But I'm with you in terms of having an ease of use inside of a single interface where it all makes sense to your brain.
Yeah.
Whatever makes sense to your brain obviously is going to work the best.
So my workflow, you guys will appreciate this. My workflow for doing dialogue, a lot of the time it was that I had a script that was divided up into blocks. And what I had to deliver very small, like not even high quality MP3 files. They were going to be linked to like a learning management system or some type of presentation, guided presentation. So I needed to deliver all of these audio files that were chopped up into little bits. The best way to do that was to run them through a single plugin. And that way you end up with, you know, if you've got 100 clips on your timeline, you've got 100 audio files then at the end of that are all processed through that plugin. Having the channel strip was really essential to doing that. Otherwise, it would have been several passes, and I digress.
Indeed.
So that's cool. So how do you predict innovation in the M&E industry? So really what the heart of that question is kind of like, what do you, when you look at what's out there, what do you think is really going to catch on and be cool?
I think like in general, M&E is the last to come to the table when there's a new tech idea. So things like machine learning or AI or cloud-based computing, like the other IT industries are already doing it before M&E is. So in general, I just look and see what other people are doing outside of M&E and go, this is going to come to M&E eventually. I also really like talking to systems integrators and manufacturers and saying, what are you guys working on? And those two things kind of help me get an idea of what's coming down the pipe and then how we might be able to use those tools.
I think a lot of people that do what you do and a lot of people that do what Ben and I do have some great answers for this question. But what's been the hardest part of your own growth in the M&E field?
Wow, that's a really good question. When I was starting out, I think it was not. There's no like central place to learn anything, right? Like you learn things as you go. You learn things from people that have been doing it more than you. You learn it from manufacturer training. But there's no like centralized wealth of knowledge, I guess. So that was really hard. I think in the last couple of years, it's gotten a lot better. There's things like Netflix partner help page, which is amazing. NAB is helpful. I think even NAB going remote this year really helped. A lot more content got pushed from that show floor into the cloud. Right.
I think you also have I've noticed too that you also have a lot of companies, a lot of organizations are putting out like, you know, blogs for education. Like Frame.io has a great blog on their site.
Yes, Frame's blog is amazing. That's a really good.
Yeah, and that's just one example. There's all kinds of other ones. There were some before that, but they were really hard to find, and you really had to know what you were looking for.
Yeah, it was mostly forums, right? I think the Creative Cow is like one of the pinnacles of knowledge for a long time. It still is, I think. If you're troubleshooting an Avid problem, it's probably the best place to go.
I actually think I owe Creative Cow for where I'm at now. Ben, what are some shows or movies that you've been watching or you think are really cool these days?
You know, I just watched a few weeks ago. We finished watching Mythic Quest on Apple TV. Okay. I thought that was really great for a few reasons. One was they have integrated the Unreal Engine into like cinematic storytelling, which is wild. I know the Mandalorian's doing that as well in a different way, but
indeed,
which is really cool. But just, this the way they've integrated like was essentially a World of Warcraft-esque game into the storytelling was fascinating. I think the other thing that was really cool was their quarantine episode, where they sent out iPhone kits to everybody and shot a whole episode remotely, and it didn't look like a Zoom call.
Nice.
Which at the time was very different than everything else coming out during this was like probably April or something like that. So that show's been really good. I think it's a really smart humor.
Yep. Okay, so same question, but for songs, composers, albums, bands.
Let me pull up my Spotify app. I got back into some old prog rock, listening to some Yes albums.
Nice.
New bands I've been listening to, a band called Saint Seneca is one of my favorite bands on the kind of indie scene. My music, I'm exposing my weird music tastes here.
That's what we love.
Yeah.
One of my favorite bands is the Mountain Goats. With their John Darnielle's sort of I don't know how you describe their music. It's quite good. He just had an album that came out a couple months ago called Songs for Pierre Chevin, and it's basically he read a book about the fall of the pagans in the twilight of the Roman Empire.
Wow.
It's fascinating.
Wow.
So anyway, he wrote like a bunch of songs about him, and I don't know, it's just a jam. He did record them all on a boombox, which is like what he used to do back in the day.
Wow.
I love stuff like that. I think he's an American treasure. His way with words is really Bob Dylan-esque, I guess. I don't know. He's much more of a poet. I was a musician in other life, so I like listening to stuff I played. I was a jazz bassist for a long time. So, I always have like some sort of big band music on in the background sometimes.
That's awesome.
The wiring I find in your brain being able to think in music, right? Being able to essentially like have a feeling and have your hands connect to a chunk of wood and some metal and make that come out as a tangible emotion that somebody can connect with is magic. And
in a different language.
It is,
right?
literally. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like any language, you have to keep practicing it, otherwise you lose it.
Yes.
Right.
Very quickly, just like if you're in shape or not in shape.
Actually, there is a line. I can't recite it. I might have to look it up. And there's a line in Name of the Wind about music being a fickle mistress. Like if you give her if you give her the time and the attention, she'll always be there when you call. But if you don't, she'll never be there when you come calling.
Right.
Yeah. I butchered it.
But it's true.
But it is true. Yeah. Very good. Well, it's been great to spend time with you today. Ben Meadors, post-production engineer for Spotify Studios.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. It's been great.
And with that, I'd like to thank our listeners for listening to The Workflow Show. I'm Jason Whetstone, Senior Workflow Engineer at Chessa.
And I'm Ben Kilberg, Senior Solutions Architect.
Email us your suggestions at workflowshow@chessa.com or shout out to us at Workflow Show on Twitter. The Workflow Show is a production of Chesapeake Systems and More Banana Productions. Thank you for listening and enjoy your day.